everybody, today we're going to be talking about the presidency and the vice-presidency of the United States. So for anyone who doesn't know, the number one thing you might be interested in is what does the president do? Well, the president is the head of the executive branch of the federal government, and he is responsible for executing the federal laws. It's important to note that he cannot execute state laws because he is not in any kind of a state position in terms of government. He is the head of the executive branch in the federal government, so he only executes federal laws. Another big job of the president is conducting U.S. foreign policy. In this area, the president is given a lot more leeway in terms of how they conduct their own policy. So when it comes to foreign policy, Congress has generally deferred that over to the president. I think a lot of that is with good reason. If anything were to happen where quick action is needed to be taken, it's a lot harder to get about almost 500 or over 500 actually members of Congress together and to come up with a quick action that needs to be taken. It's a lot easier for one person to come up there and make a decision ultimately on what actions need to be taken when it comes to national defense, and an immediate decision needs to be made. Also, Congress is just a little more happy to focus on domestic issues, and they have therefore deferred a lot of authority and a lot of leeway over to the presidency. So have the court systems. So the president enjoys a lot of leeway in that regard. However, it is important to note that there's an exception to this general rule, and that is in the case of treaties. If the Senate has ratified a treaty, that treaty is legally binding on the United States, so the president must then conduct themselves in accordance with that treaty. But beyond that, they really have leeway to do pretty much whatever they want, and this includes entering into what is called an executive agreement. So an executive agreement is basically when the president goes to another nation and they say, hey, we're going to execute our foreign policy in this manner. It happens all the time, totally a normal thing that occurs. One of the more famous ones recently is the Paris Climate Accords. It was an executive agreement the Obama administration made, but it was not a treaty. So when Trump came in and took office, he was able to just go ahead and undo the Paris Climate Accord agreement because it didn't go through the actual treaty process and become a treaty, so it was not legally binding upon the United States to behave in that certain way in terms of foreign policy or upholding our word to these other countries that we had given them under a previous administration. And perhaps the third biggest issue that the president gets a ton of leeway on is the nomination of federal officials. Now, not every federal official needs to be nominated. There are plenty who are not nominated. However, there are some key individuals who have to be nominated and confirmed by the Senate. So this means, by and large, the president gets to choose who he wants as his own advisors. This includes positions such as the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, those big cabinet level secretary positions. The president gets to nominate them. After the president nominates them, they don't just move into the role. They have to go through a confirmation process in the Senate, and as long as the Senate confirms the president's nominee, that person gets to go in and fulfill that job. Generally speaking, the Senate will oblige the president and will generally confirm that secretary, even if they have disagreements with them. The president can nominate federal judges, and this includes judges to the federal district courts, to the federal circuit courts, and to the United States Supreme Court. The most high-profile one is obviously the U.S. Supreme Court, mainly because it's the highest court in the land, and the judges there, or justices I should say, they serve a life tenure, meaning that once nominated and placed onto the court after being confirmed by the Senate, that justice gets to serve for life in their position, or until they decide to retire from the court. Now, the next thing you might be wondering is, so how does the president get elected, and how long is the president in office? Well, I did a previous video on this. I'll put a link down in the description for it. It is through the Electoral College process that the president is elected, and the president's term in office is 4 years. Now, it's 4 years, but they get to serve 2 terms. It's also important to note, as a little history lesson, that that was not always the case. When George Washington became the president of the United States, he set a precedent that the president would not serve more than 2 terms. So if you're president, you serve your 2 terms, and then you don't run again. That was going all well and dandy until the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, when he ran and was elected for a 4th term. After that happened, Congress decided it was time to amend the Constitution and then thus limit the president to serving only 2 terms in office. So moving on, we're going to discuss the vice president. So the vice president fills the office of the vice presidency. They are, or were, before being elected, the president's running mate during the campaign. And being the president's running mate during the campaign, they are elected through the same process that the president is elected through, which is the Electoral College. So the vice president serves the same length of a term that the president does. And under one important note here, the president cannot actually fire the vice president. Because this is because the vice president is technically an elected position. When you elect the president of the United States, just the way our voting system works here, you're also voting for and electing the vice president. So it's technically an elected position, and the president cannot fire the vice president. So now the next thing you might be wondering is, what does the vice president do? Well, the vice president, sad as it may seem, really has like no power at all. They're mainly there to fill the role of the presidency should the president become incapacitated or killed for whatever reason. Maybe they die in office naturally, but they're there to be able to step up and fill that position. Now, interesting detail here. There's a difference between the presidency, which is the office, and the president. So the president is the person who occupies the office of the presidency, and this is why it's important to note the difference between the two. If something were to happen and the president were to be considered incapacitated or incapable of carrying out the duties of his job, the duties of the office, power is transferred to the vice president. But this does not mean that the vice president necessarily becomes the president. The vice president is given the powers and authority of the office of the presidency. This happens on a small scale a lot when the president may be undergoing some medical procedures, and maybe they're getting put under for a little bit. You want to make sure that the country still runs smoothly, that the command and control of the nuclear arsenal remains intact, and control over the armed forces remains intact. So what happens under that scenario is the president will temporarily transfer his power and authority of the office to the vice president, and the vice president becomes the acting president, not the actual president, until the president is able to undergo the surgery, everything goes well, they are back up and they are capable of discharging the duties of the office again. Then the power just reverts back to the president at that point. However, if the president dies in office, if they're assassinated, or if they die of any natural causes, the vice president becomes the actual president and not just the acting president. That means they become the person who occupies the office of the presidency. There's some other details where this becomes important also. I'm not going to get too far into that in this video. Perhaps in a future one I will though. So that's really why the vice president is there, is to ensure that there's a smooth conducting of the federal government if something were to ever happen to the president. Other than that, the vice president is also the president of the Senate. Not a super exciting job. They can basically sit and preside over Senate proceedings, and they don't even get to vote unless there's a tie in the Senate.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
So the president could sit there all day through the vast majority of the sessions and might only get to vote a couple times. It could be one of the most boring jobs in the world, probably. However, it's important to note that more recently, presidents have begun utilizing their vice presidents in more roles, basically to go and represent the president on official business. So when this happens, the vice president actually has something to do. However, if the president becomes not too fond of you and you're the vice president, he can just choose to not utilize you. He can't fire you, but you basically can just be sitting around in the halls of the Senate, kind of sitting there doing nothing. It could become one of the most boring jobs ever, very, very quickly. And John Adams once made the comparison that the vice presidency was basically like a warm bucket of spit. Essentially, that is the case unless the president decides to utilize you as the vice president. Fortunately for vice presidents, that has become a thing, but it was not always and does not have to be. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and if you learned anything new, let me know down in the comments, and we'll see you next time.